Greetings, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Clash of Convictions. My name is Marcia Eli. I am the Director of Programs at the Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History. Let me start by inviting you to join me in acknowledging that we are gathered from locations across this city on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people, and we pay our respects to this community, their members past and present, as well as all future generations of Lenape people. Brooklyn Public Library acknowledges that it was founded on the intentional exclusions, genocide, and erasure of the Lenape. We are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies and repercussions of settler colonialism. And this acknowledgement is only the beginning of our effort. So tonight we travel back to those days of settler colonialism before this land was the United States of America, to a time when peoples with very different ways of thinking and very different worldviews circled around each other on these unceded lands. We're going to dig into some of the deep lacks in understanding between how the English colonists and indigenous peoples saw the world. Justice in particular, but also perspectives on the environment, gender, and other fundamentals. The program is inspired by the publication of this fascinating and really beautifully written book, Covered with Night, by Nicole Eustace, one of our guests tonight. And I'm really eager to begin our conversation with her and Professor Donald Grinde Jr. But first, let me share a few important notes. So it would not be surprising as you listen to this conversation if many of you were interested in exploring and perhaps buying this book. To make that a simple click for you, we'll be putting a link in the chat to a webpage at the local community bookstore here in Brooklyn with a way to find out more about Covered with Night, and if you so choose, to buy it at this local business. And of course, you can also take it out of the Brooklyn Public Library. Second, please know that you have the option to engage closed captioning tonight. Simply click that button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, you're all invited, you're all encouraged to share your questions with our speakers this evening. Simply type them into the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. Now, let me briefly tell you about our two guests and invite them to join us on this side of the screen. We'll start with Dr. Nicole Eustace. Dr. Eustace is professor of history at New York University, where she is the director of the NYU Atlantic History Workshop. A historian of the early modern Atlantic and the early United States, she specializes in the history of emotion. She is the author of Passion is the Gale, Emotion, Power, and the Coming of the American Revolution, and 1812, War and the Passions of Patriotism. Her latest book, as I just mentioned, is Covered with Night, a story of murder and indigenous justice in early America. Dr. Donald A. Grinde Jr. is professor of history at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where he served as chair of the American Studies Department and is currently director of graduate studies in the Transnational Studies Department. He's published widely on Native American topics with a particular emphasis on study of the Iroquois Confederation, the Haudenosaunee, the Haudenosaunee, and the impact of Native American thought on the development of American democracy. He actually is he may be perhaps the leading scholar on this topic. He is currently working on the Mission Indian Federation 1920 to 1970, as well as collaborating with other prominent Native American scholars on a book designed to guide tribal college curriculums to be more sensitive to Native American ideas and values. So, welcome to you both. thank you both so much for being here. I'm very excited to fill this hour with rich understanding. I'm going to start with you, Professor Eustace. Let's just start at the beginning. Can you sum up the main story that you tell in Covered with Night?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Marcia Eli, and thank you to the Brooklyn Center for History. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming from Mamaroneck, New York, which is part of the Napahoking. Ms. Eli very nicely explained exactly what that means. So this story, Covered with Night, also takes place in this basic region. It takes place in the Susquehanna River Valley, in what we would today call Pennsylvania. And it centers on a Native community there called Conestoga, which was a community that drew together Native people of many nations, including members of the Haudenosaunee, members of some Iroquoian groups that were shared language with the Haudenosaunee, but were not politically affiliated, as well as a number of different Algonquin groups, including the Shawnee. So this is a very rich and diverse Native community, and they're a trading community. And a crisis occurred in this community because two colonial fur trading brothers, men by the name of John and Edmund Cartledge, went to barter for furs with a very accomplished Native American hunter named Sawantaney, who was a member of the Seneca, one of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee. They got into an argument, they assaulted him, and they left him for dead. This was on the eve of a major treaty conference that the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee were organizing in what really was then Iroquois. Today we might call it New York. And the colonial leaders in Pennsylvania were really worried that they were going to destabilize peace across the region with this really wanton attack on this Native man. So they sent officials to the community at Conestoga to meet with representatives of the Native community there. And when they got there, they promised them what they called, quote, equal justice. They promised that they would arrest the accused murderers, that they would hold them in jail for trial, that they would be put on trial, and if they were found guilty, they would be subjected to capital punishment, exactly as if a colonist had murdered another colonist. Native people listened to that and said, no, thank you. That's not what we do in cases of crime amongst allied peoples. We would like you to accept responsibility. We would like you to apologize. We would like you to engage in rituals of reconciliation that include emotional offerings of condolences in formal ways, that include participation in spiritual ceremonies to cover the dead, that include paying reparations, making economic amends for this loss. And after a series of these ritual actions, we would actually welcome the traders back to Conestoga. They were members of this diverse community, and we would welcome them back. And they literally used the phrase, one life is enough to be lost. There should not more die for this. Well, that was not what the English were expecting, and it led to a whole series of debates. There were about a half a dozen treaty conferences held over the course of the following year. This is all happening in 1722. So over the course of that year, there were multiple treaty conferences at which each side debates what justice really means.
So this is so fascinating. I'd love to hear, Professor Grinde, a little bit about what the worldview of the Haudenosaunee is about justice. We shouldn't be surprised by this reaction that Nicole just described, because their thinking was so completely foreign to what was brought over from England. How was justice thought about and conceived?
Well, I mean, there are a variety of ways, but one of the important things to remember about Haudenosaunee society is that it is matrifocal. By that I mean that it's centered around women and their family. The longhouse was where women in a clan lived. And when a man fell in love and they got married, then he went and lived, he left his mother's longhouse. And that was a different clan. See, if it was the Wolf clan or the Bear clan or whatever, he had to marry someone from a different clan. And then he would go and live with that woman and her other sisters, as they call themselves, in that clan. And this made life much easier for women. Why? Because even if the guy left, you still had a roof over your head. Outside, there was a field with corn, beans, and squash. And, you know, so you were still taken care of, and you still had babysitters and, you know, all of those things. And also women had political power. They were able to appoint what is called peace chiefs, which are sometimes called the Confederacy chiefs. See, and each one of them comes from a clan within one of the 5 nations at this point. See, and those were chosen by a council of elder women, of which there was a head, and she was the clan mother. And also, it's important to understand about the peace chief is that he could be removed either by the clan mother or by his own wife. The clan mother might not like what he was doing and said, stop it and do it my way. And if he disobeys or doesn't pay attention to that, then she can move in and take his antlers off, as they call it. Then, too, the wife could go and say that the peace chief, my husband, and I are not having sex anymore. And then that was grounds for removal as well. See, so when I say it's matrifocal, the power is different. Sometimes people characterize Haudenosaunee society as matriarchal, but it isn't really. It's what I prefer matrifocal, that it's centered on the women, their needs come first, and then but there's very little sexual violence too, because women ask the guys out first. And
the word that you used at one point was there's a balance. I mean, what you're talking about right now are the gender roles, which would be completely foreign to the Europeans coming over. But it was a balance, a deep and profound balance.
Women do agriculture and they control it, and men support the women.
Yeah.
When the trees have to be chopped down to expand the fields, or the heavy lifting has to be done, they call on their husbands to do that. And actually, there's symbolic in that too, the planting stick. When women went out and planted corn, beans, and squash in the springtime, the planting stick had to be made by their husband, father, a male. You know why that is? It's phallic. And the women are penetrating Mother Earth and then putting the seeds in the ground and covering them up. See, and so this stick is a phallus. See, and that's part of that. That's a symbolic relationship there. And then men controlled the hunt, and women supported that by skinning and slaughtering and cooking the animals and all of those kinds of things. And some of the newlywed women would go on the hunt if they were going for 3 or 4 days out there, and she would have dinner for everybody when they came back after running after deer all day. So I'm just kind of summarizing this to give you an idea how this works, see. And there is no women ask guys out. There is no virginity thing going on here.
Well, and it sort of ties, as well to what Professor Eustace was talking about in terms of justice. There is a balance there too. It's not punitive. There's not punishment in the same way that we think of it. One could, go on about our incarceration and, all sorts of solutions that we have, but the solutions were very different. And I wonder if
part
you
of
could
that, part of
elaborate.
that, see, is that really when there's a death like this is described, then immediately people turn to the women. They turn to the wife.
That's right. And I'd
And
like
then-
to
and
describe
then they
how that
turn-
happens in this particular story, because in this story, we not only get to know Sawantaney, the Seneca man who was attacked, but we also get to meet his wife, Winnie Piweda, who was a member of the Shawnee. And so the two of them in their marriage actually illustrate this principle of balance, because they are balancing membership in more than one people at once. She is married to him, but she remains a Shawnee. And he has loyalties to the Shawnee as her spouse, and yet we know from this case, continues to be recognized as important kin by members of the Five Nations in and around Albany. Winnie Piweyata actually plays a pivotal part here. She testifies that her husband's dying words were, quote, "My friends have killed me." And that was a line that colonists just assumed meant like, oh, these traitors they were friends with the guy that they attacked. In fact, this was a formal diplomatic statement, and it meant that the Shawnee members of the community at Conestoga, along with the Haudenosaunee ones, wanted to resolve this crisis peacefully. It didn't mean they were just going to brush it under the rug. They wanted to go through this ritual process of community building. And so she really made the decisive point, and colonists were always behind. They had their own ideas about women's roles. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that there was a meeting between the wife of the murderer and the wife of the murdered man. The murderer's wife's name was Elizabeth Bartram Cartledge. And she started to cry when the colonists carted her husband off to jail. Well, in Native society, if a woman cries, that's a ritual diplomatic act, and it is saying my grief needs to be assuaged, perhaps through warfare. So Native people were very concerned, and they went to console Elizabeth. The colonial record keepers had no idea what was going on. They just saw Elizabeth as a weak woman who had given way to tears, and they just thought that the native women were responding like with some kind of feminine instinct to the tears on the part of another woman. They had no idea that something diplomatically significant had happened. So one of the things that's fascinating about drilling down into a particular story is it brings to life the meaning of the kinds of findings that Professor Grinde has been sharing in the lives of particular people, and lets us see how high the stakes were for real people.
Well, I think one of the things, though, is that identity is through the woman. These societies are matrilineal. So actually, when Sawantaney marries the Shawnee woman, he actually becomes Shawnee. And I in reading what you went through there, I saw that some of the ambiguity of the Iroquois people and government and whatever you want to say there is that, yeah, well, this guy was born a Seneca, but he married this woman that's not one of us, see? And that's an important thing in the power of women. You know, we have a joke in Native society that maternity is certainty and fatherhood is an assertion.
I want to pull out a little bit and get from you, Professor Eustace, a little of the context of what was happening, what else was happening at that time. Yeah, I mean, we know now how it played out, but what were the tensions? What was going on? This particular murder, it led to some treaty. I mean, all of this, what was the bigger background story?
So at the biggest level, this is a temporary moment of peace in long-going imperial wars for control of North America between the Spanish, but primarily in this region, the English and the French. And those of you who are history buffs will know the 7 Years' War is coming and the British are going to force the French out of North America. But in this period, in the 1720s, the French are very much a presence on the continent, and Native people, and particularly the Haudenosaunee, are able to leverage this. The Haudenosaunee really control the ground. They control the interior from the Great Lakes down through the Ohio River Valley system and over to New York. And they are really the pivotal players. So that the Europeans are constantly jockeying to try to make alliances with the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee were not monolithic. They are a confederacy of 5 and then 6 nations. And they didn't always go into lockstep, but to the best that they could, they coordinated policy amongst their separate nations and used their diplomatic skills to get the most that they could out of the English and the French. So this is a little quiet moment in 1722, but everyone's on edge. There had been a major war called the Yamasee War in South Carolina that had sent shockwaves as far as Pennsylvania, that was fought because colonists in South Carolina were enslaving indigenous people in very large numbers. That was never official policy in Pennsylvania, but it did happen. Meanwhile, William Penn, who had a more pacifistic approach toward Native people, although let's stipulate he was also a settler colonist, he died in 1718. So Pennsylvania is kind of in crisis. It's not sure what's happening. And colonists were worried about unrest amongst themselves, let alone their rivalries with the French and their efforts to negotiate with Native people, which would have also included lots of Lenape peoples in the Pennsylvania region, as well as the Haudenosaunee. So they introduced a new penal code just before this case occurred. And this case puts it to the test, because until Penn died, there were only 2 capital crimes in Pennsylvania. And after his death, they made about a dozen different things subject to capital punishment, including manslaughter cases. So it didn't have to be murder, it could be manslaughter. And other things that we might think are a little bit odd, like witchcraft, also became capital crimes, and burglaries were capital crimes. So capital punishment is suddenly on the rise in Pennsylvania just at the moment when this murder occurred.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to ask you, Professor Grinde, about the positions of putting ourselves in the shoes of the Haudenosaunee. I cannot get that. Haudenosaunee. I will get it.
It varies eventually with the 6 nations, the pronunciation.
But, you know, they're doing a lot of negotiating right now. And I want to get a sense of what their major concerns and priorities are from their perspective in these negotiations.
Well, I think that, you know, there are multiple factors here. The Haudenosaunee are playing the French off against the British. You know, that's part of their diplomacy. The French are up in Quebec, and north of the Haudenosaunee, and then the New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians and whatever, and even New Englanders are either east or south of them. And trade is an important thing. The fur trade, as it's often called. And, that is, guns, powder, and shot. But I can assure you, when the men, and often the men, they don't talk about it when they show up at Albany, but the clan mothers come along too. And you look at the records, and it's not just the guys getting powder and shot, but the women, funny thing about that, they want kettles and knives because that enables skinning deer easier and chopping them up. And see, part of the longhouse is collective, that the nuclear family is not going on here. 5 or 6 grandmas make dinner and women don't make dinner for their husband and 2 or 3 kids, and that's an important kind of thing. See, so another thing that's involved here is the notion of federalism. See, and diplomacy, like it is with the United States and the federal government, is what the peace chiefs do, But like everything else, you get down to the village level, and marriage and divorce and people getting robbed and killed and so on is more down at that level, although it can be brought up, in terms of these kinds of issues. So that's part of the whole ambiguity in this as well. See, and oftentimes these things are done to settle issues about death and murder, are done at the local level. If it's someone outside, then maybe it becomes a confederacy issue like this one. So that's part of it, and that's part of what I show in my books on the development of American government. The Iroquois constantly telling New Englanders, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and others, you guys all compete with each other. You should just have a confederacy, and all the states from New Hampshire to Georgia can come together. See, and that's an important model that's not in the British model.
Yeah, I wanted to. These are exemplar of liberty and debating democracy. Those amazing works. But what about sovereignty? With the leaders meet with the leaders, and they're tense and they're stressed about what's being lost potentially. I wanted to, for both of you, either of you, to understand better what are the roles of sovereignty, what are the roles of land rights, what are the points of really roll up your sleeves and worth digging your heels in for. Is it environmentalism questions? What are those things?
A very quick note, just to reinforce what Professor Grinde was just saying. People imagine the colonists as having a unified identity in this period, and they don't at all. One of the things this case shows is that Pennsylvania was in rivalry with Virginia and in rivalry with New York. The governor of Pennsylvania almost creates a huge diplomatic incident by arriving in the colony of New York without telling that governor that he was listening to the command of the Haudenosaunee to go and offer these ritual condolences around the staff. And he is referred to by the New York leaders as a foreigner. The colonists regarded one another as foreigners if they were from a different colony. And the governor of New York actually forbid anyone from New England to go to the conference because the fur trade was so important. and he didn't want the New Englanders to get in on it. So at a time when the Haudenosaunee are creating this very effective confederacy, the colonists are elbows out, totally rivalrous with one another. So I just really wanted to emphasize that.
You know, Pennsylvania is a bunch of Quakers, and Maryland is a bunch of Catholics, and you know, you get down to Virginia, and south of that, that's the Church of England, and you go up to New England, and it's a bunch of Puritans. And see, back in England, these were all at each other's throats. And part of the reason that England is setting up these colonies is, oh, let's ship all the Puritans to New England, and let's ship all the Quakers to Pennsylvania, and let's ship all the English Catholics to Maryland, and then we'll get rid of them, and we won't have trouble like this here, see? But that trouble is still there in these colonies that are founded on these basic religious kind of preferences. And, you know, that religion is not a big thing among Native people, see? Our way of looking at spirituality is you have to figure out a way to symbolically and so on relate to nature, see? And the way people relate to nature in Arizona is different than the way they relate to nature in Pennsylvania or New York, see? And all Native people say, yeah, that's the way you do it, but you know, that's not the way we do it. And so there were very few wars over religion, more about real estate. And that was more about, if our population is expanding, we're going to need more agricultural space. But that didn't happen much in the Americas because women, as Jefferson said in Notes on Virginia, rarely had more than 2 or 3 children because of noxious weeds. There were all of these, everybody knew that grandma, you know, well, you went out with that guy, she's a 17-year-old girl and you're too young, so here, drink this tea this morning, and that's a morning after thing. But it's also important for Europeans too. See, that witches were those same women in Europe that made the teas. And also, of course, funny thing about that, even after the rise of patriarchal religion, here in America, women from England, France, and Spain brought over Queen Anne's lace. And that's the morning after herb for many women in Europe. And I'll let you imagine why they want to bring over a weed like that and throw it around and in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and places like that.
So fascinating. I want to circle back to the book for a second. We have a lot of really great questions coming in, and I'll get to those in a minute. But Dr. Eustace, you know, this book is a collective biography in many ways. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other main characters, Captain Civility? You know, who were they? What do we know? What do we learn from their stories? Why do we care about their stories?
Thank you. Yeah, so we've talked a bit about some of the big characters already. We've talked about the murdered man Salwantani and his wife, Weenie P. Rayada. We've talked about one of the accused murderers, John Cartledge, and his wife, Elizabeth. So those are some of the prominent characters, but you've mentioned one who's really important to the story, and I think really important to the discussion we've just been having about Native values. And that is a man whose name was Takwa Taransali, who the colonists referred to as Captain Civility. And when I came across Captain Civility in the records, you know, I got very, very interested. Why were they calling him that? Prior historians have sort of suggested maybe it was like an ironic nickname because the colonists thought it was funny that someone they would have possibly referred to as a savage to call him Captain Civility, or maybe he really had excellent manners and it was a compliment to call him Captain Civility. In my research, I realized that Civility was not a personal name, it was a job title. And the title Captain Civility was used by Susquehannock Indians for at least 3 generations before the Captain Civility who comes into my story. And what I argue in the book is that this title, Captain Civility, was an early 17th century English effort to translate a native job title that they did not have a word for. Because what a Captain Civility was supposed to do was take up membership in 2 nations and serve in his own person as the embodiment of community building. He was supposed to find out the concerns of each people, bring them into communication, and do what he could to act as a go-between, to go and speak to people quietly on the side if there were points of tension, let them know what needed to happen. And so this man, Taquataranzali, lived at Conestoga, and he steps forward to help to really kind of rebuild community in the wake of this death. And he, along with another man named Sachi Choa, who was a member of the Cayuga Nation, Captain Civility and Sachi Choa really worked together as a team. They were both residents of this diverse community at Conestoga. Sachi Choa went to visit the 5 nations near Albany, gather their ideas and their opinions, and then he and Taquataranzali, Captain Civility, presented the Haudenosaunee viewpoint to the colonists and basically forced the colonists to follow native protocols. There's this dramatic moment when Sachi Choa literally takes the governor of Pennsylvania by the arm, wraps him with a string of wampum, and symbolically pulls him towards Albany. The Pennsylvania governor, it would have been really easy to just arrest his colonist and, you know, subject him to capital punishment. He does it to a few other people that summer. And we meet those people too. We meet poor servants who are executed. We meet enslaved people. So you really get a sense of the Philadelphia community. The Pennsylvania governor did not want to go all the way to Albany. He thought that that was a big hassle, but he really had no choice. He could not resolve this crisis unless he went through the diplomatic rituals expected by the Haudenosaunee, and unless he brought substantial gifts to them. And he called them presents. Marylanders commenting on the case translated the native request using the word reparations. That's not like some modern word I'm throwing in there. They were using that word at the time. But the Pennsylvania governor never admitted he was paying reparations. He said he was giving them presents. Be that as it may, he did go to Albany and they did sign a treaty in the autumn of 1722. And that treaty, I will wind up by saying, is the oldest continuously recognized treaty in the history of Anglo-American law. It's still in effect to this day. So it's a part of our collective heritage that people don't know about.
Interesting. I'm going to go to a question now from Mary Jane Cotter. I think this is for you, Professor Grinde. What was the role of the missionaries? Did they encourage rituals of reconciliation? How did they relate to the matrifocal way of life of the nations?
Well, the first missionaries are Jesuit priests, and they come and live primarily with the Mohawks who live around Lake Champlain. There's an interesting story where a Jesuit priest goes and lives, and the tradition is they take him over to this single woman and said, you can live in her house and we can marry, you know. And so he just shakes his head and says, oh no, I don't do that, you know. And oh yeah, okay. So they take him over to a guy and you can live with this guy. And he says, no, I don't do that either. And so then they just, wait a minute, you mean you don't have sex? I mean, it's just quite striking See, because like I said, you know, a woman, a wife can remove a chief by saying we're not connecting, you know. So that's one story about missionaries, see. And then, of course, Protestant missionaries go in from, you know, the Puritans and New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians. You know, they are there, you know, and they do these things, but a lot of times there's done as this is also diplomacy. See, is that this is their religion and they want us to, and we can learn about it and understand these people better, but you know, their religion is not our religion is often what the case is, see. And in the last, you know, 75 years, when they stopped having boarding schools, the number of Christian Indians percentage-wise has dropped significantly from, you know, like 80% down to 35 or 40%. So, because now you're no longer coerced into doing this.
And that's a whole other program, which we should have.
Yeah.
Here's a question from an anonymous person. What was the lingua franca at the time? Did the Europeans speak Haudenosaunee languages? How was trade negotiated? Getting into the weeds, how did they communicate?
In Pennsylvania, the first people to encounter the colonists were members of the Lenape, so Algonquin speakers. And Pennsylvanians primarily learned to speak Algonquin languages. They didn't really learn Iroquoian languages. So in order for translation to happen, you needed these teams of translators. And that was why Sachichoa and Taquatar Sale, otherwise known as Captain Civility, worked together as a team, and they actually needed a third intermediary. So they had to get words from Iroquoian languages into Algonquin languages, and then from Algonquin languages into English. And Captain Civility knew multiple Algonquin and Iroquoian languages, because these are language families, like Romance families or dramatic language families. They're not all the same language. He knew multiple languages from multiple native language families, but he didn't know English. And I think that's really very telling, because at this point, the native world is not centered on colonists and their interactions with colonists. Yes, they had to interact with colonists sometimes, but a diplomat was really primarily concerned with building relationships amongst native peoples. And then they expanded that out to the colonists. But so language barriers were always a big challenge. And Professor Grinde was talking about so-called New France, what we now call Canada, where Jesuit missionaries did learn Haudenosaunee languages. But in Pennsylvania, at least in this period, that seems to not have been as common for settler.
They develop a Mohawk dictionary by, I think it's 1650, 1660. And that's so young Jesuit priests can study Mohawk in France before they come over, see. But it's also important to understand that Mohawk and Seneca is, you know, it's kind of like English and French, or French and Spanish. They're related, you know, and some of the words, but, you know, most of us, if we don't study French, we're kind of lost, right? And that's the way the Five Nations languages are. They're related, but they're not intelligible to people that aren't, you know, particularly Seneca to Mohawk, which is, you know, one's the eastern edge of the Confederacy and one's the western edge of the Confederacy.
So this is a really interesting question from William Sorelli. I think that's how you pronounce your last name. And sort of circles back to what we began talking about, which are these really different concepts of justice and right and wrong, savage, civility. And he asks, when did it become common to consider the indigenous people as less human savages? And I would love, Professor Grinde, for you to, to reflect on that and tell us how, how to reconcile some of the really, extreme images we have been served, scalping and blood feuds, with the great law of peace and the trajectory.
The Great Law of Peace is to resolve the blood feud. Before the Great Law of Peace, someone would kill someone in another village or another nation, and then it would go back and forth. Particularly as people describe it, the women would say, you've got to go and bring back a scalp and prove that you killed one of the other people to revenge for my son or husband or grandson or whatever it was. See, and so the great law was to go over that and create the condolence ceremony, which Nikki talks about in her book, where you give gifts, and that stops the blood feud, which is just, or the mourning wars, as they called it. That's MOURNING. And that was an important part of the Great Law of Peace. See, this is a way to get around revenge killing. See.
And just to thank you, that was really, really beautifully put. Just to put it in a broader perspective in terms of European attitudes, European imperialists always said they were bringing civilization. That goes back to the Roman Empire. They were bringing civilization to Britain. The first people that the English invaded were the Irish, and they were all about the idea that they were more civilized than the Irish, and that their invasion was actually bringing the gift of civilization. When the King of England gave William Penn a charter for Pennsylvania, creating the fiction that the British king could grant native land to one of his favorite courtiers, when he gave Penn a charter for Pennsylvania, part of his mission was that he was supposed to bring civilization to the native people, the native inhabitants, as they would have said, of Pennsylvania. So the imperialists are always sure that they're the ones bringing civilization. And part of the fun of the book is for the reader to kind of assess where the reader finds civility to really reside.
Well, savage comes from the French word sauvage, which literally means people that live in the woods. And it was something that the French talked about, people that lived in the woods and hunted in France. And see, colonization was rationalized by the church. One of the big things is the doctrine of discovery, see, that non-Christians don't have rights. They don't have a soul. So when, Christopher Columbus or somebody goes over there and finds this place, and he actually reads things out, are you Christians, and stuff like that. And if not, if you are, make the sign of the cross. If not, we're going to invade and kill you, kind of thing. See, so that's part of conquest. It was justified by the church, and this was it's important that this was developed during the Crusades, because many Christians said, well, I don't want to go to the Middle East and kill those people in there. And the Pope said, well, wait a minute, they're not baptized. So when you kill a Muslim, it's like killing a dog. You're not killing a human being. And then that was transferred to the New World. See, and that's the conquest ideology. And it's important. There's a famous comedian, Black comedian, And he talks about being in New York City on Columbus Day. And he says, and up rolls a brand new Cadillac on Fifth Avenue. So he says, so I pull out my gun, put it to the guy's head and says, get out of your Cadillac. I've discovered your Cadillac. See? And then he said, then I climbed in and I drove off. I discovered his Cadillac. And that was his way of talking about the doctrine of discovery. See, because it's one thing to say, God gave me this. But of course, if you don't have the gun, then it's just a bunch of words, you know?
Yeah, that's completely so significant as a point that civilization and Christianity went hand in hand in the minds of settler colonists. And when it comes to the first Spanish conquistadors, they literally did think that they were somehow still fighting Muslims when they were taking over native people's lands. And so you have diarists like Bernal Diaz claiming that they were burning mosques when they burnt native holy places. In what we would now call Mexico. So yeah, Christianity was closely linked to so-called civility in the minds of the settler colonists.
You know, and these struggles and fights are very, very alive right now today. You know, I'd like to move us to sort of parallel conversation for our last 9 or so minutes about today, about justice today. And in particular, I guess I'd like to start, Professor Grinde, by asking you a little bit about your activism and advocacy. You have had a career as both a historian and as a political activist. And I'm wondering what, you know, what the relationship is between your scholarship and advancing the American Indian movement, and also when you put your pulse on, you know, August 4th, 2021 today, you know, where we are.
Well, I think that, you know, I was a member of the American Indian movement. I wrote speeches for Russell Means, and we, you know, protested, and you know, all of those kinds of things. And some people criticized me as a scholar, you know, for being so active and so on. But I said I can't not do that and still be a Native person. I admit my bias. When I write and when I read documents, I see it from a Native person's point of view, and I said, and that should be valued. My first 2 books were printed by Native American presses, you know, or controlled by it, that were controlled by Native Americans because they were so controversial. So I think it's important that people understand. I even had some Native scholars early on, 40 years ago, tell me, we're so thankful about the books you've written because I can't talk about that in class, but I can assign your book. And I was just taken aback by that statement. You know, I'm at a conference and someone at the University of Arizona who's a Native person is saying that to me, a Native scholar. But, you know, times have changed, you know. Deb Haaland is the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, you know. And by the way, she's a member of the Norwegian Indian Mafia like me. You know, Grinde is a Norwegian name. And her father was a Norwegian American, and as was mine. See, and then my Karen Swisher, who became president of Haskell University, she's part of the Mafia too. And, you know, there are several others. And they used to ask us, you know, why are there so many of you, and you know, that are Norwegian Americans and Indian? And Karen Swisher used to say, well, you know, because see, Norwegian Americans, they don't tell Polish jokes in Minnesota, they tell Norwegian American jokes. She would say that's because Norwegian Americans are so dumb, that they marry Indians and stay married to them and raise these kids up and send them to college. And of course, that's Deb policy, you know, in terms of building the bridge between the two cultures, you know, and, you know, but when you have a native mother like her and me, you know, dad, well, see, another thing I must say, my father's family came here over 200 years ago. And part of the reason they came was that the monarch in Norway was forcing people that still believed in Thor to actually stop doing that rather than just nominally going to church 4 or 5 times a year and then doing the other stuff. So came here and then moved to Wisconsin, and oh, there's Indians and their stories are, I remember my father gave me a copy of the Norse sagas when I was like 11 or 12 years old. And I said, oh yeah, I can understand this. I can see the similarities between the two. Well, I'll let Debbie, I'll let Nikki talk to you.
The pulse of August 4th. Thank you. No, just you've had an extraordinary life. I enjoyed actually hearing you talk a little bit. August 4th, you know, in this country, we are in a crisis of mass incarceration. I think that we're really, I hope, at a pivot point of starting to think about reforms and harm reduction. So I think that we have the benefit of the past. There's more in the toolkit of American history than people realize. That when you think of founding documents of the United States, you probably don't think of the Albany Treaty of 1722. And yet this is part of our heritage, part of our history. And the statements in it about the equal value of life, the idea that a person's human worth is not erased by one moment of violence is, I think, incredibly important. And it's not about anybody getting off scot-free. There has to be acknowledgement. There has to be a long ritual process of rebuilding community, reweaving ties. But the idea that all people have human worth is a profound value of Native peoples that found its way into the Great Treaty of Peace that was based on condolences, and that I think really kind of provides, you know, an alternate heritage that we could turn to as we move our way forward.
Beautifully said. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, which is sort of unbelievable. It's just been, you know, so engaging and immersing to listen to both of you and hear your stories and your expertise and your wisdom. I wonder, I guess I want to give you both another chance to say a sort of final thing. And we had talked a little bit earlier about land acknowledgements. And of course, we started with a land acknowledgement. And I'd love to go out by asking both of you your views on what happens now. What's next after land acknowledgements? What are we hoping for? Why don't we start with you, Professor Grinde?
Well, I think that, you know, that there are over 120 million acres that should have been given back to Native people in treaties. See, that when you get out to the Mississippi River, many of the treaties said that basically we're going to take this, but after 25 years, no white person wants it, we'll give it back to you. And they never did that. They created national parks, national forests, and all those kinds of things. And when I talk about land restoration here in New York, they said, well, you want to displace white people. I said, no, almost 40% of the land in New York State is still state or federal forests. And if you restore some of that to Native people, you're not kicking a white person out of their farm or their house, and a lot of people just don't realize that. And we have very different ways of treating the land, see, and we have very different ways of looking at the world, and we want to preserve that, see. And if people want to listen to how we do that, that's fine. But we're not going to go out and convert people or whatever. We just want to do our thing, see. And that's really, an important aspect of what Native rights is about. And I think Deb Holland will begin to do some of that, when I started talking about returning the land, many people who were environmental activists stopped us and said, we're not going to give back national parks and state forests to you. We want these wildernesses to be there. And they have this sense that a wilderness is someplace where people don't live. And yet we know everywhere we lived, see. And, one last story, the buffalo, we wanted to create a buffalo land area in the Dakotas. And people said, well, we'll do that, but we don't want you to live there. And we said, the Lakota people said, well, the buffalo need us. You have to kill the squareheads. Otherwise, if you allow the squareheads, which are these genetic throwbacks, to breed, one bad winter and half the herd will die. But if you kill the squareheads, only about 5 or 10% of the herd will die in a bad winter. See, and that our idea is we need each other. And that's a very different kind of thing in some ways.
Dr. Eustace?
I guess I would just say that I think listening to Native people and finding out what they want while realizing it's not monolithic is the most important thing that we can do. In my corner of the world, I'm an educator, and college graduation rates for Native people are still very, very low. And the more that we have Native people who are able to get educated and then able to advocate more effectively, recuperate history, and to make plans for progress, the better. So yeah, having someone like Deb Holland as kind of a leading figure is an incredible moment. And I think that, we graduated a couple of Native people at NYU this past spring, and it was an unbelievably moving event because it's still not, it should just be commonplace, and it isn't yet. So I think that's, I always think that education is the place to start, and from there, many, many different things can grow. And when people are educated, they can amplify their voices, and we can find out what they want.
And it's not just men leading. My friend Winona LaDuke, she wound up running for vice president. She's still an environmental activist, and that's very common for people to have Winona LaDuke and Deb Holland and women that are very much with the American Indian movement. We used to have a joke. We would give speeches and at places and stuff, and we would judge that if the women show up, we're going to get somewhere. And that was the joke, that you can't go anywhere without the support of women, and like I said, it's balance, but they're important, see, and women are mothers, and you want women to be enthusiastic about that, not forcing them to be baby machines and have 10 kids, you know. And in our society, women control their bodies. They found a guy, let's have kids together, but you know, 2 or 3 is fine. And that's it. And that's why North and South America was never overpopulated. See, in spite of people living here for 15, 20 years, some people say 30,000 years. See, so that's because of women controlling their body. And that actually hindered problems with the frontier, because when you would have epidemics or wars, Native women wouldn't say, oh, let's have a dozen kids now to repopulate. No, they'd still 2 or 3, you know. And that, whereas, you know, white women were having 8, 10 kids on the frontier, you know, and they were all going to Kentucky, you know, or someplace.
Well, I think that there is clearly a lot that we have to learn, both about justice and gender roles. And I want to tell everybody that the Center for Brooklyn History is actually developing another conversation that will happen this fall about the land back movement. And I hope that you'll keep your eyes on our upcoming program so you can join us for that. I want to thank Nicole Eustace for this book, which is so beautifully written. There we go. And thank you, Professor Grinde, for all of your scholarship. You've really added to our knowledge, all of our knowledge. I want to thank all of you for being here. And let you know that the program was recorded and we will be posting it tomorrow on the Center for Brooklyn History YouTube channel, and a link to that I think may go into our chat, or actually it's, so there we go. And I hope that you'll all explore the programs offered by the Center for Brooklyn History and Brooklyn Public Library's Arts and Culture arm, BPL Presents, and join us for many, many, many more discussions in the future. So with that, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and have a good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the conversation. Good night.
Yeah, it's been great. I hope that I made some contributions.
For sure. Thanks.